The wagon wheels ground to a halt in the frozen mud, and Margaret Harrington stepped down with a leather purse in one hand and a Bible in the other. "You've mourned long enough, Lydia," she said, her voice carrying across the empty yard like a knife through winter air. "Thomas is gone. The baby is gone. This land belongs to his brothers now, and there's no place here for a woman who brings nothing but grief." Lydia stood on the porch steps, her shawl pulled tight against the November wind, watching her late husband's mother count out $7 silver onto the wagon bed. "That's all you're giving me?" The older woman's eyes were ice. "That's more than you deserve. If you want to see how far determination can carry a soul through the darkest winter, subscribe to this channel right now. And leave a comment with your city. Let's see how many places this story reaches. You won't believe where this goes." Margaret Harrington had always been a woman of absolutes, right and wrong, worthy and unworthy, blood and stranger. And in the 14 months since Thomas had died from the fever, and the 8 months since Lydia had lost the baby in childbirth, Margaret had made her position clear in 1,000 small cruelties. A turned shoulder at church, a withheld invitation to Sunday dinner, a conspicuous silence whenever Lydia's name was mentioned in the presence of neighbors. Now, standing in the November cold with her 2 remaining sons flanking her like sentries, Margaret delivered her final verdict. "You'll take the money," she said, dropping the coins back into the purse and tossing it onto the wagon bed beside a small trunk. "You'll take what's in that trunk, your dresses, your mother's quilt, whatever personal items I saw fit to pack. And you'll leave this property before sundown." Lydia's hands shook, but not from the cold. "Thomas left me this house in his will." "Thomas left you nothing." Margaret's voice was sharp as breaking glass. "The will was never properly witnessed. Judge Morrison reviewed it himself last week. This land reverts to his brothers, as it should have from the beginning." Samuel Harrington, Thomas's eldest brother, shifted his weight and looked away. He'd always been the quieter one, uncomfortable with confrontation, but too dutiful to his mother to object. Beside him, Robert stared straight at Lydia, with something that might have been pity or might have been contempt. She couldn't tell anymore. "Where am I supposed to go?" Lydia heard the desperation creeping into her voice and hated herself for it. "It's November. The winter's coming early this year. Everyone says so." "That's not our concern." Margaret climbed back onto the wagon seat with the assistance of Robert's extended hand. "You should have thought of that before you failed to give my son an heir that survived." The words hit like a physical blow. Lydia felt her knees weaken, but she locked them in place, refusing to let this woman see her crumble. "I loved Thomas. I loved our baby. You think I wanted—" "What I think," Margaret interrupted, gathering the reins, "is that you are a burden this family can no longer afford, emotionally or financially. Samuel and Robert have wives to support, children to feed. The land can't sustain another mouth, especially one that contributes nothing." "I work," Lydia said, her voice rising. "I've worked every day since Thomas died. The garden, the chickens, the—" "The garden that barely produced? The chickens that stopped laying last month?" Margaret's laugh was bitter and cold. "You're a poor farmer, Lydia, and a poorer widow. You should have remarried by now. Found some man desperate enough to take damaged goods." Samuel flinched at that, and for a moment Lydia thought he might speak up, might defend her. But he just cleared his throat and examined his boots. Robert, however, stepped forward. "Mother's right," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. "It's not personal, Lydia. It's practical. The land can't support all of us. You're young enough to start over somewhere else. Find work in a town. Maybe meet someone who—" "Who what?" Lydia's voice cracked. "Who'll take the widow who lost everything? Who'll want a woman who couldn't even keep her own child alive?" The silence that followed was brutal. Even Margaret had the grace to look away for a moment. Then she snapped the reins and the wagon lurched forward. "Wait!" Lydia called out, running after them. "At least tell me where I can go. The nearest town is—" 40 miles south, Samuel said quickly, as if eager to contribute something, anything, to ease his conscience. "There's a settlement called Hartwell. They might have work, maybe a boarding house that needs help." 40 miles in November? Lydia stared at him in disbelief. Margaret didn't look back. "You have until sundown to clear out. After that, we're locking the house and burning anything you leave behind." The wagon rolled away, and Lydia stood in the yard watching it disappear into the gray afternoon. The wind picked up, cutting through her thin shawl and dress, reminding her that winter wasn't just coming, it was already here, crouched at the edges of the sky, waiting to pounce. She had $7 silver, a trunk of clothes, and nowhere to go. The house felt like a stranger's home as Lydia packed her remaining belongings. Every room held ghosts. Thomas laughing at the breakfast table, the baby's cradle in the corner of the bedroom, still covered with the blanket she'd knitted during those hopeful months when she'd believed the future held promise instead of loss. She worked quickly, methodically, refusing to let herself feel anything. Feeling was a luxury she couldn't afford right now. Survival required focus. Her mother's quilt went into a canvas bag, along with 2 changes of clothes, a small cooking pot, matches wrapped in oilcloth, a hunting knife Thomas had given her on their wedding day, and a leather-bound journal she'd kept since she was 15. The trunk Margaret had packed contained 3 more dresses, 2 pairs of boots, a winter coat that was too fine for hard travel, and a framed photograph of her and Thomas on their wedding day. Lydia looked at the photograph for a long moment, then wrapped it carefully and placed it at the bottom of the bag. She couldn't carry much. $7 wouldn't buy passage on the stage, and even if it could, stages didn't run regularly this far north in winter. She'd have to walk, which meant traveling light and moving fast. But walk where? 40 miles to Hartwell. She'd been there once, years ago, before she married Thomas. It was a rough settlement of maybe 300 people, built around a lumber mill and a handful of supply stores. There'd been a church, she remembered, and a boarding house, run by a stern-faced woman who'd smelled of lavender and vinegar. Could she make 40 miles before the snow came? Lydia looked out the window at the darkening sky. The clouds were low and heavy, pregnant with the season's first real storm. She had maybe 3 days, 4 if she was lucky. 3 days to walk 40 miles, carrying everything she owned. She'd done harder things. She'd buried a husband and a child. She'd endured Margaret's cruelty and the whispers of neighbors who treated her like a contagion. She'd survived 14 months of grief so profound it had sometimes felt like drowning in an endless black lake. She could survive this, too. Lydia changed into her sturdiest dress and pulled on the heavier of her 2 pairs of boots. She wrapped the canvas bag and secured it across her back, tested its weight, adjusted the straps. It wasn't comfortable, but it was manageable. She took one last look around the house, at the life she was leaving behind, and felt something break loose inside her chest. Not grief exactly, but a kind of grim acceptance. This chapter was over. Whatever came next would have to be written on different pages, in a different hand. She walked out without locking the door. Let Margaret and her sons have their precious land. Let them burn what remained. Lydia was done being haunted by the past. The road south stretched empty and cold before her, and she started walking. The first 6 miles passed in a kind of numb determination. Lydia kept her head down against the wind and focused on putting one foot in front of the other. The landscape was familiar at first. Rolling prairie broken by occasional stands of cottonwood. The same terrain she'd traveled with Thomas when they'd first married and moved north to claim this land. But as the afternoon wore into evening, the familiarity faded. The road grew rougher, less maintained. She passed an abandoned homestead, its windows dark and vacant, the barn door hanging loose on broken hinges. A reminder of how many people had tried to make a life out here and failed. She couldn't think about failure, not now. By the time darkness fell, Lydia had covered maybe 10 miles. Her feet ached, her shoulders burned from the weight of the bag, and hunger gnawed at her stomach. She'd left without eating, too focused on packing and escaping before Margaret changed her mind and took even the $7 away. She needed to stop, needed to rest, but there was nowhere safe. The prairie stretched endlessly in all directions, offering no shelter except the occasional cluster of trees. Lydia knew enough about winter survival to understand that sleeping in the open was dangerous, even deadly. But she also knew she couldn't keep walking in the dark. One wrong step, one twisted ankle, and she'd be stranded. She spotted a small grove of trees near what looked like a creek bed and made her way toward it, moving carefully in the dim starlight. The temperature was dropping fast, and she could see her breath in white puffs. The grove offered minimal protection, but it was better than nothing. Lydia cleared a small area of dead leaves and branches, then used stones to build a fire ring. She had matches, and there was enough dry wood nearby to sustain a small fire for a few hours. The flames caught quickly, and the heat was immediate and precious. Lydia sat close, warming her hands, and allowed herself to eat one of the 2 biscuits she'd wrapped in cloth that morning. The food was tasteless, but it filled the hollow in her stomach. She tried not to think about tomorrow, or the day after that. Tried not to calculate how many more miles she had to cover, how much food she had left, how cold it would get when the real winter arrived. Instead, she focused on the fire, on the simple act of breathing, on the fact that she was still alive and still moving forward. That would have to be enough. The sound woke her before dawn, a low rumbling that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Lydia sat up sharply, her hand instinctively reaching for the knife beside her bedroll. The fire had died to embers, and the cold was brutal, seeping through her coat and dress like ice water. Then she realized what the sound was. Thunder. She looked up at the sky and felt her heart sink. The clouds were massive, black and roiling, moving fast from the north. This wasn't the first snow of the season. This was something worse. A storm system that would dump feet of snow and bring temperatures down to deadly levels. She had hours at most before it hit. Lydia scrambled to her feet, kicking dirt over the embers and shouldering her bag. She had to find real shelter. The grove of trees wouldn't protect her from a blizzard. She'd freeze to death long before morning. She started walking south again, faster now, ignoring the pain in her feet and the exhaustion that made her legs feel like lead. The wind picked up, biting through her clothes, and the first snowflakes began to fall, small and hard, more like ice pellets than soft snow. 3 miles. 4. 5. The landscape began to change. The prairie gave way to rougher terrain, with rocky outcroppings and shallow ravines carved by ancient rivers. Lydia remembered this area from her trip to Hartwell years ago. There'd been caves, she recalled. Small ones, barely more than hollows in the rock, but deep enough to offer protection from the wind. If she could find one before the storm hit in full force, she might survive. The snow was falling harder now, reducing visibility to just a few yards. Lydia could barely see the path ahead, but she kept moving, following the ravine along what she hoped was still the southern route. Her hands were numb despite her gloves, and her face felt raw from the wind. Then she saw it, a dark opening in the rock face, partially hidden by scrub brush and drifted leaves. It wasn't large, maybe 6 feet across and 8 feet deep, but it was shelter. Lydia stumbled toward it, dropped her bag at the entrance, and crawled inside. The cave was cold and dark, but it was dry, and the wind didn't penetrate beyond the first few feet. Lydia collapsed against the back wall, breathing hard, her whole body shaking from cold and exhaustion. Outside, the storm descended like a hammer. The wind howled with a sound like breaking bones. Snow poured from the sky in blinding sheets, piling up at the cave entrance with terrifying speed. Within minutes, the world outside had disappeared into a white void. Lydia pulled her bag close and wrapped herself in her mother's quilt, trying to conserve what little warmth she had left. The cave offered protection from the wind and snow, but it was still bitterly cold. She could see her breath in thick clouds, and her fingers were already turning white at the tips. She needed fire, but the wood she'd collected was wet from the snow, and the matches in her bag felt precious, too valuable to waste on damp kindling that might not catch. So she sat in the darkness, listening to the storm rage outside, and tried not to think about dying. This was survival now. Not comfort, not hope, just the brutal arithmetic of staying alive, 1 hour at a time. And somewhere in the back of her mind, a small voice whispered that Margaret had been right after all. She was damaged goods, a burden, a woman who brought nothing but grief. Lydia closed her eyes and willed the voice to silence. She'd survived this long. She'd survive a little longer. She had to. The storm didn't stop. It raged for 18 hours straight, and Lydia measured time by the changing quality of darkness, the deep black of night, giving way to a gray murk that might have been dawn, then sliding back into shadow as the snow continued to fall. She couldn't feel her toes anymore. That was the first real problem. The second was that her water supply consisted of snow she'd scraped from the cave entrance and melted in her mouth. And the cold was so severe that drinking it made her teeth ache and her throat burn. The third problem was hunger. She had 1 biscuit left, and no idea when she'd be able to forage for food again. But the fourth problem was the one that terrified her most. She was starting to hear Thomas's voice. "You can't stay here forever," he said, his tone gentle but insistent, exactly the way he'd sounded when he was trying to convince her of something she didn't want to accept. "You'll freeze or starve. You know that, don't you, Lydia?" "I know," she whispered back, her breath forming white clouds in the dim light. "But I can't go out there either. Not in this." "Then you'll die here." "Maybe." She pulled the quilt tighter around her shoulders, though it offered little warmth now. The fabric was damp from her breath and the moisture in the air, and damp cloth in winter was worse than no cloth at all. "Would that be so terrible?" "Yes." His voice was sharp now, almost angry. "Don't you dare give up, Lydia. Not after everything you've survived." "Everything I've survived?" She laughed, and the sound was bitter and hollow in the small cave. "Thomas, I lost you. I lost our baby. Your family threw me out like garbage. I'm sitting in a cave in the middle of a blizzard with $7 and no future. What exactly am I surviving for?" Silence. Then, "For yourself." The words hung in the cold air, and Lydia felt something crack inside her chest. Not grief this time, but anger. Pure, clean, furious anger. "Myself," she repeated. "The self that everyone says is worthless? The self that couldn't save you, couldn't keep our child alive, couldn't even grow a decent garden? That self?" "The self that's still breathing." Thomas's voice was fading now, becoming indistinct. "The self that walked 10 miles in freezing weather and found shelter before the storm hit. The self that's strong enough to be angry instead of just broken. That self, Lydia." Then he was gone, and she was alone again with the howling wind. Lydia sat very still for a long moment, feeling the anger pulse through her veins like liquid fire. It was warming, in its way. Warmer than the quilt. Warmer than any phantom conversation with her dead husband. Margaret was wrong. Robert was wrong. Every person who'd looked at her with pity or contempt for the past 14 months was wrong. She wasn't worthless. She wasn't damaged goods. She was alive, and she was furious. And fury was a better fuel than despair. "All right," she said aloud to the empty cave. "All right, I'll survive. But not for you, Thomas. Not for them. For myself." When the storm finally broke on the second day, Lydia crawled to the cave entrance and looked out at a transformed world. The snow had piled in drifts 6 feet high in some places, covering the landscape in a blinding white blanket. The sky was clear now, pale blue and merciless, and the sun glinted off the snow with an intensity that hurt her eyes. She had to move. Staying in the cave meant freezing to death slowly, and Lydia had decided she wasn't going to die. Not here, not like this. But she also couldn't continue south to Hartwell, not with the snow this deep. She'd sink to her waist with every step, and 30 more miles of that would kill her as surely as staying put. Which meant she had to make the cave livable, at least until the weather cleared enough for travel. The thought was both terrifying and oddly exhilarating. She'd never built anything in her life beyond a garden fence and a chicken coop. But Thomas had taught her some things about construction, and her father had been a stonemason before he died. She had knowledge, even if she'd never applied it this way before. "First things first," she muttered, her voice hoarse from disuse and cold. "Fire." She needed dry wood, and the only way to get it was to dig through the snow and find fallen branches that had been protected from the worst of the storm. Lydia wrapped her scarf around her face and ventured out into the brutal cold, moving slowly, conserving energy. The work was exhausting. Every step required enormous effort, and the cold bit through her gloves until her fingers felt like wooden sticks. But after an hour of searching, she'd gathered enough dry kindling to start a small fire, along with several larger branches that could burn for hours once they dried out. Back in the cave, she arranged the kindling carefully, using dried moss and strips of bark for tinder. Her hands shook as she struck the match, and for a heart-stopping moment, the flame flickered and nearly died. Then it caught, spreading to the moss, then the bark, then the kindling. Heat. Blessed, precious heat. Lydia held her hands over the flames and felt the sensation return to her fingers. First numbness, then tingling, then sharp pain that made her gasp. But pain meant blood flow, and blood flow meant life. She fed the fire slowly, carefully, making sure it burned clean and didn't smoke too badly. The cave's natural draft drew most of the smoke toward the entrance, which was a small mercy. As the warmth spread through the small space, Lydia allowed herself to eat the last biscuit and drink melted snow from her cooking pot. The food disappeared too quickly, and her stomach remained hollow and aching. But at least she had something. Tomorrow she'd have to find more food. Tonight, she'd focus on not freezing. The next morning brought a new crisis. Her boots were falling apart. Lydia stared at the leather in disbelief, watching the sole peel away from the upper portion where the stitching had rotted through. These were her good boots, the ones she'd worn for church and town visits, not work boots designed for hard travel. The cold and wet had destroyed them in just 2 days. "Of course," she said bitterly. "Of course they're ruined." She had a second pair in her bag, but they were lighter. Summer boots, really, not designed for deep snow and freezing temperatures. If she wore them now, they'd be destroyed within days too, and then she'd have nothing. Which meant she needed to repair the good boots somehow, make them last. Lydia examined them closely, turning them over in her hands. The stitching had simply disintegrated, the thread rotted from age and moisture. But the leather itself was still sound. If she could re-stitch them. She had her sewing kit. It was meant for mending clothes, not boots. But thread was thread. It wouldn't be as strong as the original cobbler's work, but it might hold long enough to get her to Hartwell. She spent the next 2 hours working by firelight, forcing the needle through the tough leather, pulling the thread tight, repeating the process again and again until her fingers bled and her eyes burned from the strain. But when she finished, the boot held together. It wasn't pretty, and it wouldn't win any prizes, but it would function. The second boot took another hour, and by the time she finished, the weak winter sun was already setting. One day in the cave, and she'd accomplished 2 things: fire and functional footwear. It didn't sound like much, but it was survival. Small victories adding up to continued existence. She fell asleep that night with her boots tucked under her arm, keeping them warm and dry, and dreamed of nothing at all. On the 4th day, hunger became impossible to ignore. Lydia's stomach cramped constantly now, and she felt lightheaded whenever she stood too quickly. She needed food, but the landscape offered little in November. The summer berries were long gone, the edible roots buried under feet of snow, the small game in hibernation or hiding. She remembered her grandmother's lessons about winter foraging. The inner bark of certain trees was edible if you were desperate enough, and there might be pine nuts if she could find the right kind of pine cones. Squirrels cached food in tree hollows. If she could locate one, she might steal their stores. The thought made her feel like a thief, but survival had no room for pride. She ventured out into the snow again, this time traveling farther from the cave, following a line of trees along what she thought might be a frozen creek bed. The cold was less brutal today, maybe 20 degrees instead of the bone-breaking cold of the blizzard, but it was still dangerous. She had maybe 2 hours before she'd need to return to the fire. She found a stand of cottonwood trees first, and used her knife to strip away the outer bark and expose the inner layer. It was white and fibrous, and when she tasted it, the flavor was bland and slightly bitter, but not inedible. She cut several long strips and wrapped them in cloth, saving them for later. Then she spotted it, a cluster of pine cones scattered near the base of a large pine tree. Fresh cones, recently fallen, with the scales still tight. Squirrel work, almost certainly. Lydia gathered as many as she could carry, stuffing them into her bag, and searched the tree trunk for the cache. She found it 10 minutes later, a hollow about 6 feet up, packed with pine nuts and dried berries. "I'm sorry," she whispered to whatever squirrel owned this hoard. "I'll pay you back somehow. I promise." She took half the cash, leaving the rest, and hurried back to the cave before guilt could change her mind. That night, she roasted pine nuts over the fire and ate them slowly, savoring each one. They were small and required patience to crack open, but they were rich and oily and filled the empty space in her stomach better than anything had in days. She also boiled strips of cottonwood bark in her cooking pot, creating a thin, bitter tea that at least provided warmth and some nutrition. It wasn't enough, not nearly enough, but it would keep her alive for a few more days while she figured out what came next. The decision came on the 7th day, and it arrived not as a grand revelation, but as a simple, practical calculation. She couldn't reach Hartwell before her supplies ran out completely. Even if the weather cleared tomorrow, she was too weak now to make the journey. The deep snow would slow her down, and without adequate food and water, she'd collapse long before she covered 30 miles. But she also couldn't abandon the cave and wander aimlessly, hoping to find another settlement or a homestead willing to take her in. Winter had locked down the entire region, and travel was suicide. Which left only one option: make the cave into something more than a temporary shelter. Transform it into an actual dwelling. Survive here until spring, then make the journey south when conditions improved. The idea was insane. The idea was also the only path forward that didn't end with her frozen body being discovered by some unlucky traveler in April.
"All right," she said aloud, needing to hear the words spoken in her own voice. "I'm staying. I'm making this work."
The cave was small, maybe 8 feet deep, 6 feet wide, 7 feet high at the tallest point. The floor was uneven rock, the walls bare stone. There was no door, no chimney except the natural draft, no insulation beyond what the rock itself provided. She'd need to improve all of that if she wanted to survive until spring. Lydia spent the rest of that day taking inventory. She had her knife, her cooking pot, the remains of her sewing kit, $7 silver that were useless without a store to spend them in, 2 candles, her journal, a few matches left, and the clothes on her back plus 2 extra dresses. Not much to build a winter home with, but it was what she had. The first improvement was obvious. She needed to seal the cave entrance.
Not completely. She still needed ventilation for the fire, but enough to block the worst of the wind and keep the heat from escaping. She ventured out into the snow and began gathering stones, stacking them at the cave entrance, building a rough wall that left a gap at the top for smoke and a small opening at the bottom for entry. The work was brutal, and her hands became raw and bleeding despite her gloves. But by nightfall, she'd created a barrier that cut the wind significantly. The difference was immediate. The cave felt warmer, more enclosed, almost cozy despite its bareness. She collapsed by the fire that night and allowed herself a moment of satisfaction. 1 week ago, she'd been thrown off her land with nothing. Now she had shelter, fire, and a plan. It wasn't much, but it was hers. The 8th day brought a visitor. Lydia was outside collecting more firewood when she heard it. The unmistakable sound of a horse moving through snow, followed by a man's voice calling out. "Hello? Is someone there?" She froze, her heart hammering. Who would be traveling in these conditions? A trapper, maybe? Or a rancher checking on winter pastures? Or, and this thought sent ice through her veins, someone Margaret had sent to make sure she was truly gone. The voice called again, closer now. "I saw smoke. If you need help, I'm friendly." Lydia grabbed her knife from her belt and positioned herself behind a tree, watching the direction of the sound. A moment later, a man on horseback emerged from the tree line. Tall, maybe 40 years old, wearing a heavy coat and a wide-brimmed hat crusted with snow. He saw her immediately. "Easy," he said, holding up both hands to show they were empty. "I'm not here to hurt you. Name's Daniel Rivers. I run cattle about 15 miles northeast of here." "There's no cattle range 15 miles northeast," Lydia said, keeping her voice steady despite the fear hammering in her chest. "Just open prairie." "That's right," he smiled slightly, "which is why I run cattle there. Nobody else wants it." Despite herself, Lydia almost smiled. "What do you want?" "Saw your smoke 2 days ago. Figured someone was either in trouble or crazy enough to be camping in November. Thought I'd check which." His eyes moved past her to the cave entrance, taking in the rough stone wall. "Looks like maybe a bit of both." "I'm fine," she said quickly. "I don't need help." "Didn't say you did." Daniel swung down from his horse, moving slowly and keeping his hands visible. "But I'm guessing you didn't plan to spend the winter in a cave by choice." Lydia said nothing. "Look," Daniel continued, his voice gentler now. "I'm not asking for your life story, but I've been ranching in this territory for 20 years, and I know what November looks like when it's about to turn into December. You can't survive here with what you've got, not without serious preparation." "I'll manage." "Will you?" He gestured at the cave. "You've got a fire and some stones. That's good work, better than most would do. But when the real cold hits, and it will,
In about 2 weeks. That fire is going to eat through wood faster than you can gather it. You'll be out there in 20 below weather trying to find dry branches, and you'll freeze before you make it back. Lydia's jaw clenched. What do you suggest then? Walking 30 miles to Hartwell in this snow? No. Daniel pulled something from his saddlebag, a bundle wrapped in oilcloth. I suggest accepting some supplies from a neighbor who's got extra. Coffee, dried meat, flour, beans. Enough to last you a month, maybe more if you're careful. She stared at the bundle, her pride warring with her desperation. Why would you help me? Because I can. He set the bundle on a flat rock near the cave entrance. And because whatever put you out here alone in November, I'm guessing it wasn't your choice. Lydia felt tears prick at her eyes and blinked them back furiously. I can't pay you. Don't want payment. Daniel climbed back onto his horse. But I'll be back in 2 weeks to check on you. If you need anything else, wood, tools, medical supplies, you let me know then. Why? Lydia's voice cracked. Why are you doing this? Daniel looked at her for a long moment, and something in his expression was both sad and knowing. Because somebody helped me once when I needed it. Figured it was time to pass it on. He turned his horse and rode back into the trees, leaving Lydia standing in the snow with the bundle at her feet and the first real hope she'd felt in 14 months burning in her chest. The bundle contained more than Daniel had described. Lydia unwrapped the oilcloth with shaking hands and found coffee, yes, and dried meat and flour and beans, but also salt, matches, candles, a whetstone for her knife, and the small axe with a note tucked into the handle wrapping. For firewood, the handle's loose, needs tightening. Dr. She held the axe like it was made of gold. With this, she could cut proper wood instead of scavenging fallen branches. She could build, repair, improve. The possibilities cascaded through her mind so fast she felt dizzy. But beneath the gratitude was something else, a gnawing suspicion that wouldn't quiet. Why had Daniel really helped her? Men didn't just give away supplies in winter, not without expecting something in return. Her experience with Thomas's family had taught her that generosity always came with strings attached, invisible, until they pulled tight around your throat. He'll be back, she muttered, storing the supplies carefully at the back of the cave. In 2 weeks, he said, and then we'll see what he really wants. But even as she spoke the words, she couldn't quite make herself believe them. There had been something genuine in Daniel's eyes, something that looked almost like recognition, as if he'd seen himself in her circumstances and remembered what it felt like to be desperate. Still, trust was a luxury she couldn't afford. Not anymore. The axe transformed everything. Within 3 days, Lydia had cut enough firewood to fill one entire side of the cave, stacking it carefully to dry. She built a proper frame for drying wet wood near the fire, using green branches she'd stripped of bark. She carved wooden pegs and drove them into cracks in the cave wall to hang her belongings and keep them off the damp floor. The physical work exhausted her, but it also gave her a strange kind of peace. Every swing of the axe, every piece of wood stacked, every small improvement to her shelter was proof that she was still capable, still useful, still worth the air she breathed. Margaret's voice echoed in her memory. You're a poor farmer, Lydia, and a poorer widow. Maybe, Lydia said aloud, splitting another log with a satisfying crack. But I'm a damn good survivor. She'd taken to talking to herself more frequently, filling the silence with her own voice, because the alternative, listening to nothing but wind and her own dark thoughts, was unbearable. Sometimes she argued with Margaret's phantom criticisms. Sometimes she conversed with Thomas, though those exchanges had become less frequent as the days passed. Sometimes she simply narrated her actions, grounding herself in the present moment. Now I'm banking the fire for the night. Now I'm checking the stone wall for gaps. Now I'm boiling water for coffee. The coffee was a revelation. She rationed it carefully, allowing herself 1 cup each morning, and the ritual of brewing it became a marker of civilization, a reminder that she was still human, and not just some animal huddled in a hole, waiting for spring. On the 10th day in the cave, she woke to find the temperature had dropped so severely that ice had formed on the inside of the stone wall.
No,
She whispered, touching the ice with her fingertip.
no, no, no.
If ice was forming inside the shelter, that meant the cold was penetrating deeper than the stone wall could block. She needed better insulation, needed to seal the gaps more effectively, needed... She forced herself to stop panicking and think methodically. What did she have that could provide insulation? Her extra dresses could be hung against the wall, creating an air pocket. She could stuff moss and dried grass into the cracks between stones. She could build a second, inner wall using smaller stones and create a dead air space between the 2 layers. Lydia spent that entire day working on improvements, her breath visible in thick clouds, her fingers going numb despite the fire burning steadily in the corner. She hung one dress against the wall using the wooden pegs, then another.
She ventured outside and dug through the snow to find dried grass and moss, stuffing it into every crack and crevice she could find. By nightfall, the cave felt marginally warmer, and no new ice had formed. It was a small victory, but it counted. That night, she made herself write in her journal for the first time since leaving the house. Day 10. Still alive. Starting to believe I might actually survive this.
Daniel returned on day 14, exactly when he'd promised. Lydia heard the horse before she saw him, and this time she didn't hide. She stepped out of the cave entrance, knife still at her belt, but her hands empty and visible. "You're still here," Daniel said, swinging down from his horse. He looked genuinely pleased, which caught her off guard. "Good. I was worried you might have tried for Hartwell anyway." "I considered it," Lydia admitted. "Decided it was smarter to wait for spring." "Smart woman." He pulled another bundle from his saddlebag, this one larger than the first. "Brought you some things. Blankets mostly. Wool. Figured you'd need them when December hits properly." Lydia accepted the bundle, her throat tight. "You can't keep doing this." "Can't I?" Daniel's expression was mild, but there was something challenging in his voice. "Who's going to stop me?" "I can't pay you back. I didn't ask for payment." He cut her off gently. "How are your supplies holding up? Coffee gone yet?" "No, I've been rationing." "Good. But you'll need more before winter's out. I'll bring another bag next time." "Next time?" Lydia stared at him. "How many times are you planning to come back?" Daniel shrugged. "Until spring. Once every 2 weeks, maybe once a month if the weather turns really bad. Long as you're out here, I figure somebody should check you're not dead." The bluntness should have been offensive, but somehow it wasn't. It was honest, and Lydia found herself respecting that more than she would have respected pretty lies. "Why?" she asked quietly. "And don't tell me it's because someone helped you once. Nobody's that generous without a reason." Daniel was silent for a long moment, and something shifted in his expression, a kind of pain that looked old and well-worn. "My wife died in childbirth 8 years ago," he said finally. "Our first baby. Both of them gone in one night." Lydia's breath caught. "Afterward," he continued, "people treated me like I was broken, like I was made of glass that might shatter if they said the wrong thing. They brought food and offered condolences and looked at me with pity until I wanted to scream." He met her eyes. "But there was one old rancher, fellow named Cal Morrison, who showed up at my place 3 weeks later and said, 'You gonna sit here feeling sorry for yourself, or you gonna get back to work?' Best thing anyone could have said to me. What happened to him? Lydia asked. Died 5 years back. Heart gave out. Daniel smiled slightly. But before he went, I thanked him. Asked him why he'd been so hard on me when everyone else was being gentle. You know what he said? Lydia shook her head. He said, because you didn't need gentle. You needed someone to remind you that you were still alive. And alive means working, not waiting to die. Daniel gestured at the cave, at the improvements Lydia had made.
Looks like you figured that out on your own. But I thought maybe you could use someone checking in, making sure you have what you need to keep figuring it out. Lydia felt something loosen in her chest, some tight knot of suspicion and fear unraveling. You really don't want anything from me? Not a thing. Daniel climbed back onto his horse. Well, maybe one thing. When you get to spring and you're ready to move on, wherever you decide to go, you remember that there are still decent people in the world. Don't let whoever drove you out here convince you otherwise. He rode away before she could respond, leaving her standing in the snow with wool blankets in her arms and tears freezing on her cheeks. The cold came like an invading army. In the third week, temperatures plunged so low that Lydia's breath crystallized in the air before it could dissipate. The fire became her constant companion, and she fed it carefully, knowing that if it went out, she might not survive long enough to restart it. The wool blankets Daniel had brought made the difference between miserable and bearable. She wrapped herself in them every night, cocooned so tightly she could barely move, and still woke shivering in the gray dawn light. Food became a different kind of challenge. The dried meat and beans required careful rationing, and Lydia found herself counting every mouthful, calculating how many days she could stretch each portion. She supplemented with pine nuts when she could find them, and stripped more cottonwood bark for the bitter tea that at least kept her stomach from feeling completely empty. But hunger was a constant presence now, a hollow ache that never fully went away. She'd lost weight. Her dresses hung loose on her frame, and her face felt sharp and angular when she touched it. You look like death, she told her reflection in the small hand mirror she'd found at the bottom of her bag. But you're still alive. That counts for something. On day 23, disaster struck. Lydia was outside gathering more wood when she heard the crack, sharp and sudden, followed by a rush of sliding snow. She looked up just in time to see a massive drift collapse from the outcropping above the cave, tons of snow and ice cascading down. She ran, but not fast enough. The edge of the avalanche caught her, knocking her sideways into a snowbank. Her head cracked against something hard, a rock or a fallen branch, and pain exploded behind her eyes. The world tilted, spinning, and then everything went dark. She woke to firelight and the smell of coffee. For a disoriented moment, Lydia thought she was back in the house with Thomas, that everything since his death had been a horrible nightmare. Then her vision cleared, and she saw Daniel kneeling beside her, holding a cup of steaming coffee. Easy, he said as she tried to sit up. You hit your head pretty hard. Probably have a concussion. What? Her voice came out as a croak. How? Found you unconscious about 3 hours ago. Snow had partially buried you. Another hour, and you would have frozen to death. His expression was grim. You're lucky I decided to check on you early. Lydia's hand went to her head and found a bandage wrapped around it. You did this? Couldn't very well leave you bleeding. Daniel helped her sit up slowly, supporting her with one arm. The cut wasn't too deep, but head wounds bleed like hell. Scared me half to death when I first saw you. She accepted the coffee with shaking hands, sipping it slowly. The warmth spread through her chest, anchoring her back to reality. The cave is fine. Snow didn't reach the entrance. Your supplies are safe. Daniel sat back on his heels, studying her face. But you can't stay here anymore, Lydia. This was too close. Next time you might not be so lucky."
"I have nowhere else to go," she said flatly.
"You could come back to my place. I've got a small ranch house, plenty of room." "No." The word came out harsher than she intended.
"I can't. I won't be dependent on anyone again. I won't put myself in a position where someone can throw me out whenever they decide I'm not worth keeping around."
Daniel was quiet for a moment. "Is that what happened? Someone threw you out?" Lydia looked away.
"My husband died. His family inherited the land. They didn't want me."
"So they cast you out in November?" Daniel's voice was tight with controlled anger. "What kind of people—"
"The kind who think widows are burdens."
Lydia met his eyes. "The kind who made it very clear that I had no value without Thomas. And they were right, weren't they? I couldn't even keep a garden alive." "That's bullshit," Daniel said bluntly. "You've survived 3 weeks alone in winter conditions that would kill most men. You've built shelter, found food, kept yourself alive through sheer determination. That's not worthless. That's extraordinary." Lydia felt tears prick at her eyes and blinked them back.
"Then why does it feel like I'm just delaying the inevitable? Like I'm going to die out here eventually anyway?"
"Because you're alone," Daniel said quietly. "And being alone makes everything harder." "But you don't have to be alone, Lydia. Not if you don't want to be." "I can't go to your ranch," she repeated. "I can't put myself under someone else's roof and someone else's rules. Then I'll help you build something better here." Daniel gestured at the cave. "This shelter's good for survival, but it's not built for a full winter. The avalanche proves that. But if you had proper walls, a real roof, a chimney, you could make it through." Lydia stared at him. "You'd help me build an actual structure?" "I would." Daniel stood, brushing snow off his pants. "I've got lumber at my place, tools. I can spare a few days' work, and I can teach you what you need to know for the rest. By the time winter really sets in, you'll have a cabin instead of a cave. Something solid, something that's yours."
"Why?"
The question burst out of her like a sob.
"Why would you do all this for a stranger?"
Daniel looked at her for a long moment, and his expression was sad and knowing and unbearably kind. "Because 8 years ago, I wanted to die too. I wanted to just stop fighting and let the grief take me under. And Cal Morrison wouldn't let me. He kept showing up, kept dragging me back to life, kept reminding me that I had value even when I couldn't see it myself." He paused. "Maybe I'm paying it forward. Or maybe I just can't stand the thought of someone as strong as you giving up because she's been told lies about her worth." Lydia's vision blurred with tears, and this time she didn't try to stop them. "I don't know how to accept help." "That's all right," Daniel said gently. "I'll teach you that too." They started building the next day. Daniel brought lumber and tools on a sledge pulled by his horse, along with more supplies, nails, a saw, rope, canvas for temporary shelter while they worked. He'd also brought more food, which Lydia accepted with less resistance this time. "We'll build next to the cave," Daniel explained, sketching a rough plan in the snow with a stick. "Use it as a back wall and foundation. Save materials and give you double insulation. Cabin doesn't need to be big, maybe 12 feet by 10. Just enough for a bed, a stove, storage."
"A stove?"
Lydia's eyes widened.
"You have a stove?"
"Got an old one in my barn. Was my grandmother's. Haven't used it in years, but it still works." Daniel grinned at her expression. "Makes a hell of a difference in winter. You'll actually be warm instead of just not freezing." They worked from dawn until the light failed each day. Daniel taught her how to measure and cut lumber, how to fit joints, how to drive nails without bending them. Her hands blistered and bled, but she kept working, kept learning, kept building. The framework went up first, rough posts and beams that defined the shape of what would become her home. Then walls,
board by board, each piece fitted carefully and nailed into place. Daniel worked alongside her, never making her feel incompetent, always explaining the reasons behind each decision. "Why are we angling the roof this way?" Lydia asked on the third day. "Snow shed," Daniel replied. "Too flat, and the weight will collapse it. Too steep, and you waste materials. This angle's just right. Snow slides off, but you still have headroom inside." "How do you know all this?" "Built 3 barns and 2 houses in my time. Made plenty of mistakes along the way." He grinned. "Lucky for you, I've already made them, so you don't have to." By the end of the first week, the basic structure stood complete. 4 walls, a roof frame, a door opening, and a space for the stove. It wasn't finished, wasn't weatherproofed yet, but it was recognizable as a building, as shelter, as something permanent. Lydia stood inside it that evening after Daniel had left, running her hands along the rough wood walls, and felt something shift in her chest. This wasn't just survival anymore. This was a home. Something she'd built with her own hands, something that belonged to her completely. For the first time since Thomas died, she allowed herself to imagine a future that stretched beyond just getting through the next day. The stove arrived on day 32, and with it came the first real argument. "You can't just give me a stove," Lydia said, standing in the half-finished cabin with her arms crossed. "This is too much, Daniel. I can't—" "Can't what?" Daniel interrupted, setting the heavy iron stove down with a grunt. "Can't accept something that might save your life? Can't let someone help you without assuming there's a price attached?" "There's always a price," Lydia shot back. "Always. You think I don't know how this works? You give me things, I become obligated, and then one day you decide what you want in return." "What do you think I want?" Daniel's voice was sharp now, frustrated. "You think I'm doing this to trap you into something? To make you feel like you owe me?" "I don't know!" The words burst out of her, raw and desperate. "That's the problem. I don't know what you want. And not knowing makes me feel like I'm back in that house, waiting for Margaret to tell me what I'm worth, what I'm allowed to have, what I'm allowed to be." She stopped abruptly, breathing hard, horrified at what she'd just revealed. Daniel's expression softened. "I want you to survive the winter," he said quietly. "That's all. I want you to be warm and fed and alive come spring. And after that, I want you to make your own choices about where you go and what you do. No obligations, no debt. Just a neighbor helping a neighbor because it's the right thing to do." Lydia looked away, feeling tears burn in her eyes. "I don't know how to believe that." "Then don't believe it. Just accept the stove anyway." Daniel moved toward the door, then paused. "You know what the difference is between me and your husband's family? They told you your value was tied to what you could give them. I'm telling you, your value exists whether I'm here or not. The stove doesn't change that. It's just a stove." He left before she could respond, and Lydia stood alone in the unfinished cabin, staring at the cast-iron stove and trying to understand why kindness felt more frightening than cruelty. Installing the stove required cutting a hole in the roof for the chimney pipe, and Lydia insisted on doing the work herself. "You sure?" Daniel asked, watching her climb onto the roof frame with the saw. "It's tricky to get the angle right." "Then teach me how to get the angle right," Lydia replied. "I need to know how to do this in case something goes wrong after you're gone." Something flickered in Daniel's expression. Surprise, maybe, or respect. "Fair enough. Mark your cut line here, where the roof pitch changes. Make sure you leave enough room for the pipe to clear, but not so much that snow gets in around the edges." Lydia marked the line carefully, checked it twice, then began to saw. The work was awkward, and her arms ached within minutes. But she kept going, kept cutting, until the hole was complete, and the pipe could slide through cleanly. "Perfect," Daniel said when she climbed down. "You're a natural at this."
"I'm not natural at anything," Lydia muttered, but she felt a small flush of pride anyway. "I just pay attention." That's all building is, paying attention and not giving up when it gets hard. Daniel handed her the chimney pipe. "Ready to finish this?" They worked together to seal the stovepipe into place, using clay and metal flashing to weatherproof the opening. Then they connected the stove itself, fitting the pieces together like a puzzle until smoke could flow freely from firebox to chimney. When they lit the first fire that evening, heat radiated through the small space with an intensity that made Lydia gasp. "This is—" She held her hands out to the stove, feeling warmth soak into her bones for the first time in weeks. "I didn't know it could be like this." "Like what?" Daniel was banking the fire in the old cave entrance, preparing to let it die out now that the stove would handle heating. "Warm. Actually warm. Not just less cold." Lydia laughed, and the sound startled her. She couldn't remember the last time she'd laughed. "I feel like a person again." Daniel smiled. "You were always a person, Lydia. You just needed better shelter to remember it." The weather turned vicious in early December. Temperatures dropped to 30 below zero, and the wind howled with a sound like dying animals. Snow fell in blinding sheets, piling up in drifts that reached the cabin's roofline. Lydia couldn't see more than a few feet beyond the door, and venturing outside, even for firewood, required ropes tied to the cabin so she wouldn't get lost in the whiteout. Daniel stopped coming. Not because he'd abandoned her, Lydia understood that now, but because travel in these conditions was suicide. She was completely alone, just her and the cabin and the stove that kept the cold at bay. But she wasn't afraid anymore. The cabin held. The stove burned clean and hot. She had food, water, firewood stacked to the ceiling. Everything she needed to survive was within these four walls she'd helped build. On the 15th night of the blizzard, Lydia sat by the stove and wrote in her journal. Day 47. The storm continues, but I'm warm and fed. Daniel taught me well. The cabin is holding against everything winter can throw at it. I built this. I survived this. Margaret was wrong about me. They were all wrong. She paused, then added, Thomas would be proud, I think. Not because I'm surviving for him, but because I'm surviving for myself. Daniel returned when the storm finally broke, bringing news that changed everything. There's a wagon train forming in Hartwell, he said, stamping snow off his boots at the cabin door. They're planning to head west in early spring, Oregon territory, looking for settlers who can handle hard country. Lydia looked up from the stew she was stirring on the stove. Why are you telling me this? Because you might want to join them. Daniel pulled off his gloves and held his hands out to the stove's heat. Fresh start, new territory, no history following you. Might be exactly what you need. Something cold settled in Lydia's stomach. You want me to leave? What? No! Daniel's head snapped up, his expression genuinely shocked. That's not... I just thought you'd want to know about your options. You said you couldn't go to Hartwell before. Now you could, if you wanted. But you think I should? Lydia heard her voice go flat, defensive. You think I should take my survival skills and move on before I become too much of a burden? Lydia, stop. Daniel's voice was sharp. I don't think any of those things. I'm giving you information, that's all. What you do with it is your choice. But you wouldn't mind if I left? Of course I'd mind. The words came out louder than Daniel seemed to intend. He took a breath, visibly controlling himself. I'd mind a great deal. But this isn't about what I want. It's about you having options, having freedom to choose instead of being trapped by circumstance.
Lydia stirred the stew with more force than necessary, her mind churning. Oregon Territory, a wagon train, hundreds of miles from Nebraska, from Margaret, from everything that had happened here. "What would I do in Oregon?" she asked quietly. "Anything you wanted. They're looking for farmers, craftspeople, anyone willing to work hard and build something new." Daniel paused. "You've proven you can do that."
I've proven I can survive. That's not the same as building a life.
"Isn't it?" Daniel moved closer, his voice gentle now.
Look at what you've done here, Lydia. You've built a home from nothing. You've learned skills most people never master. You've survived conditions that would have killed someone weaker. If that's not building a life, what is? Lydia looked around the cabin, at the solid walls, the sturdy roof, the stove that glowed with heat and security. "This wasn't a life," she said slowly. "This was survival. There's a difference." "What difference?" "Survival is just not dying. A life is—" She struggled to find the words. "It's having purpose, beyond just making it through another day. It's having connections, community, something to work toward that matters." "And you don't have that here?" "Do I?" Lydia turned to face him fully. "I have a cabin in the middle of nowhere, miles from the nearest settlement, dependent on a man who shows up every few weeks with supplies, because I can't make it on my own." "That's not true," Daniel interrupted. "You've been on your own for 3 weeks. The storm would have killed me if I'd tried to travel. You survived without me." "But I wouldn't have this cabin without you. I wouldn't have the stove, the tools, half the knowledge I need to make it through spring." Lydia's voice cracked. "I'm still dependent, Daniel. Just on you instead of Margaret. And I swore I'd never be dependent on anyone again." The silence that followed was heavy and complicated. Then Daniel said, very quietly, "Is that how you see me? As someone you're dependent on?" "I don't know how else to see it." Lydia wrapped her arms around herself. "You've given me everything. How is that not dependency?" "Because dependency means you can't function without someone. What we have—" Daniel stopped, corrected himself. "What you've learned is partnership. I taught you skills. You applied them. I brought materials. You built the structure. I offered knowledge. You made choices. That's not dependency, Lydia. That's collaboration. But when you leave, when I leave, you'll still have the skills I taught you. The cabin won't disappear. The knowledge won't evaporate." Daniel's voice was steady, patient. "You're confusing accepting help with being helpless. They're not the same thing." Lydia felt something shift in her chest, some fundamental assumption cracking open. "My whole life, people have told me that needing help meant I was weak." "Your whole life, people have been lying to you." Daniel's voice was fierce now. "Everyone needs help sometimes. That's not weakness. It's being human." The argument about Oregon came up again 3 days later, and this time Lydia was the one who raised it. "Tell me about the wagon train," she said abruptly, interrupting Daniel's explanation of how to repair roof shingles. "What would it cost to join?" Daniel set down the shingle he'd been holding. "About $20 for a wagon spot. You'd need your own supplies, food, tools, bedding. Maybe another $30 total." "I have $7. I could—" "No," Lydia cut him off. "I'm not asking you to pay for it. I'm just stating facts. I don't have enough money to join a wagon train, which means Oregon isn't actually an option for me." "It could be, if you work through the winter. I could pay you for helping around the ranch. Not charity, actual wages for actual work. By spring, you'd have enough." Lydia studied his face. "Why do you want me to go so badly?" "I don't want you to go at all." The admission seemed to cost Daniel something.
But I want you to have choices. Real choices. Not just taking what you can get because you're desperate. And if my choice is to stay here? Daniel's expression was carefully neutral. Then you stay here. And you'd be fine with that? Having a neighbor living alone in a cabin 15 miles from your ranch? I'd be better than fine with it. Daniel's voice was quiet, but certain. I'd be glad. But it has to be your choice, Lydia. Not because you're afraid to leave. Not because you think you owe me. Not because you don't have other options. It has to be because you want to stay. Lydia looked away, her throat tight. I don't know what I want. That's fair. You've got months to figure it out. Daniel picked up the shingle again. Now, pay attention. When you're replacing a shingle, you need to slide it up under the one above it, like this. The turning point came on day 63, in the middle of the worst blizzard yet. Lydia was alone. Daniel had left 5 days earlier, before the storm hit, and the wind was so strong it shook the cabin walls. Snow drove through every tiny gap in the construction, creating small drifts inside, despite their careful weatherproofing. She was sitting by the stove, trying to conserve firewood while staying warm enough to function, when she heard it. A desperate pounding on the cabin door. Lydia grabbed her knife and approached cautiously. Who's there? Please! The voice was female, young, barely audible over the wind. Please help! I'm freezing! Lydia threw open the door and a woman collapsed into the cabin, covered in snow and ice, shaking so violently her teeth chattered. She looked maybe 20 years old, with dark hair frozen in icy chunks and skin that had gone gray-white with cold. Close the door, Lydia commanded, catching the woman before she hit the floor. Get it closed, now! The woman managed to kick it shut, and Lydia dragged her toward the stove, peeling off frozen outer layers with practiced efficiency. What's your name? Lydia asked, wrapping the woman in blankets. Clara Thompson. The words came out in gasps. Was traveling to Hartwell with my brother. Wagon broke down. He went for help. Said to wait, but I got so cold. Started walking. Got lost. How long have you been out there? Don't know. Hours, maybe. Everything stopped making sense. Lydia recognized the symptoms. Advanced hypothermia, early-stage frostbite on the fingers and nose. She'd read about it in one of Thomas's old medical texts. The woman needed warmth, but not too fast. Rapid warming could be as dangerous as the cold itself. Listen to me, Clara. You're going to be fine, but you have to do exactly what I say. Lydia's voice was calm, authoritative, nothing like the uncertain woman who'd left her husband's house 2 months ago. Don't rub your hands or feet. Don't try to warm them directly. Just sit here by the stove and let the heat come to you gradually. She brewed hot tea, sweet with precious sugar, and made Clara drink it in small sips. She checked the woman's extremities every few minutes, watching for signs of tissue damage. She kept the stove burning steadily, maintaining a consistent temperature that would warm Clara without shocking her system. It took 4 hours before Clara's shaking subsided and color returned to her face. "He saved my life," Clara whispered, tears streaming down her cheeks. "I thought I was going to die out there." "You almost did." Lydia handed her more tea. "Your brother, did he make it to Hartwell before the storm hit?" "I don't know. God, he's probably worried sick. Probably thinks I'm dead." "He'll look for you when the storm breaks. Until then, you're safe here." Clara looked around the cabin, taking in the solid construction, the warm stove, the organized supplies. "You live here? Alone?" "Yes." "How?" Clara's expression was odd. "How do you survive out here by yourself?" Lydia felt something click into place in her mind, some final piece of understanding she hadn't known she was missing. "I learned," she said simply. I learned what I needed to know, and I built what I needed to build, and I kept going even when I wanted to quit. That's all survival is, really, just refusing to give up. I would have died if I'd tried that, Clara said quietly. I don't have your strength. Yes, you do. Lydia's voice was firm. You walked through a blizzard searching for help instead of lying down and freezing. You made it to this cabin when you could barely see 5 feet ahead. You survived, Clara. That takes strength. The words echoed in Lydia's own ears, and she realized she was talking to herself as much as to Clara. She'd survived, too. She'd built a life from nothing but determination and the willingness to accept help when it was offered. Margaret had been wrong. Lydia wasn't worthless. She wasn't damaged goods. She was a woman who'd faced impossible circumstances and emerged stronger. And more than that, she was a woman who could help others now, who had knowledge and skills worth sharing, who had value that existed completely independent of anyone else's judgment. The storm raged outside, but inside the cabin, Lydia felt something like peace settle over her for the first time in 2 years. Daniel arrived the next morning with Clara's brother James in tow. The reunion was tearful and grateful, and James insisted on pressing money into Lydia's hands. $10, more than she'd had in months. I can't accept this, Lydia protested. You saved my sister's life, James said firmly. This is nothing compared to what that's worth. Please, take it. Lydia looked at the money, then at Daniel, who was watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. Take it, he said quietly. You earned it. So she did. After Clara and James left, heading back to Hartwell with Daniel's guidance, Lydia sat in her cabin and counted out $17 total. 7 from Margaret, 10 from James. Enough to join the wagon train to Oregon, if that's what she chose. Or enough to buy supplies to expand the cabin, improve the ranch, build something permanent here. The choice was hers. For the first time in her life, the choice was entirely hers. The $17 sat on the table for 3 days before Lydia touched them again. She counted them each morning and each night, as if the number might change, as if the choice might somehow make itself. Oregon meant freedom from the past, but uncertainty about the future. Staying meant building on what she'd started, but facing every ghost that haunted this territory. On the 4th morning, Daniel arrived with unexpected news. Hartwell's organizing a spring market, he said, brushing snow from his coat. First one in 3 years. They're looking for vendors, people selling goods, offering services. Thought you might be interested. Lydia looked up from the bread she was kneading. Why would I be interested? Because you've got skills people need. You know winter survival better than anyone I've met. You could teach it. Sell your knowledge. Daniel pulled out a chair and sat. There's money in that, Lydia. Real money. Teaching people how not to freeze to death? Teaching people how to build proper shelters, how to weatherproof, how to find food in winter. Half the homesteaders who come through here die in their first year because they don't know what you know. His voice was earnest. You could save lives and earn a living at the same time. Lydia's hands stilled in the dough. You think people would pay for that? I think people would line up for it. Daniel leaned forward. Clara's already been talking you up in Hartwell. Word spreading about the woman who survived winter alone in a cave and saved a life in a blizzard. People want to learn from you. The idea settled into Lydia's mind like a seed finding soil. Teaching. Not just surviving, but helping others survive. Turning her hard-won knowledge into something valuable, something that could sustain her beyond Daniel's charity and luck. What about the wagon train? She asked quietly. What about it? Daniel's expression was carefully neutral. If you want to go to Oregon, go. But you don't have to run away to have a future, Lydia. You could build one right here. A future doing what? Living alone in a cabin, teaching survival skills a few times a year? Why does it have to be alone? The question came out softer than Daniel seemed to intend. Why does building a life here mean isolation? Lydia's breath caught. What are you asking me? Daniel stood abruptly, moved to the window, his back to her. I'm asking if you've considered that maybe staying doesn't mean being alone. That maybe... He stopped, started again. I'm not good at this. Sarah always said I talked around things instead of saying them straight. Then say it straight. Lydia's heart was pounding. Daniel turned to face her. I want you to stay. Not as someone I help out of obligation. Not as a neighbor I check on every few weeks. I want you to stay because He ran a hand through his hair, frustrated. I care about you, Lydia. More than I thought I could care about anyone after Sarah died. And I think maybe you care about me too. But I can't tell if that's real or if you just feel obligated because I helped you. The confession hung in the air between them, raw and vulnerable. Lydia's throat was tight. You think I might care about you out of obligation? Don't you? Daniel's voice was rough. How do you separate gratitude from genuine feeling when someone saved your life multiple times? The same way you separate pity from genuine feeling when you're helping someone who's lost everything. Lydia stood, facing him across the small cabin. You think I haven't wondered if your kindness is just guilt over Sarah? If you're trying to save me because you couldn't save her? That's not... Daniel stopped. Maybe at first. Maybe the first time I rode out here, part of me was thinking about her. But that's not why I kept coming back. Why did you keep coming back? Because every time I saw you, you were stronger, more capable, more yourself instead of who other people told you to be. His voice dropped. Because you reminded me what it looks like to refuse to break even when everything's trying to shatter you. Because talking to you felt like breathing after holding my breath for 8 years. Lydia felt tears prick her eyes. I don't know how to trust this. I don't know how to believe that someone could want me without needing something from me. Then don't trust it yet. Daniel's voice was gentle now. Stay anyway. Build your teaching business. Make your own money, your own choices. I'll be here when you're ready to believe it's real. Or I won't, if that's what you need. But either way, you stay because you want to, not because I asked. Before Lydia could respond, the sound of horses outside shattered the moment. 3 riders emerged from the tree line, and Lydia's blood turned to ice when she recognized the lead horse. Samuel Harrington dismounted first, followed by Robert and a man Lydia didn't recognize. Older, official-looking, carrying a leather satchel. Lydia, Samuel's voice was stiff, uncomfortable. We need to talk. Daniel stepped outside first, positioning himself between the riders and the cabin. She doesn't need to talk to you about anything. You made your position clear when you threw her out in November. This isn't about that. Robert's face was red, whether from cold or shame, Lydia couldn't tell. This is legal business. We have documents she needs to see. Lydia pushed past Daniel, her fear hardening into anger. What documents? What are you doing here? The older man stepped forward. Mrs. Harrington, I'm Edmund Price, attorney from Hartwell. I've been trying to locate you for 2 months. These gentlemen finally tracked you down through reports of a woman living alone near the river. I'm not Mrs. Harrington anymore, Lydia said coldly. I was never really family to these men. What do you want? Price opened his satchel and withdrew papers. Your husband's will has been contested and reviewed by Judge Morrison. The original ruling, that it was improperly witnessed and therefore invalid, has been overturned. Lydia's world tilted. What? Thomas's will was properly executed, Price continued.
The witnesses have been located and their testimony verified, which means the land does belong to you, as Thomas intended. The Harrington brothers' claim is void. Samuel looked physically ill. Mother forced us to contest the will, said it was family property, said you had no right. Where is Margaret? Lydia's voice was deadly quiet. Dead, Robert's voice cracked. Died in January from pneumonia. Before she died, she confessed to Judge Morrison that she'd pressured the witnesses to disappear, paid them to stay silent. The judge reopened the case. Lydia stared at them, unable to process what she was hearing. The land was hers, had always been hers. She'd been cast out based on a lie, had nearly died in the wilderness, had rebuilt herself from nothing, and all of it had been unnecessary. The rage that flooded through her was white-hot and consuming. You threw me out in November, she said, her voice shaking. You took everything I had, gave me $7, and told me I was worthless. You let me believe I had no home, no future, no value. And now you come here and tell me it was all a lie? We didn't know, Samuel started. You knew enough. Lydia's voice rose to a shout. You knew I was grieving. You knew winter was coming. You knew I had nowhere to go. But you did it anyway because your mother told you to. We're sorry, Robert said miserably. We're so sorry, Lydia. We came to make it right. The land is yours. The house is yours. We've cleared out all our things. You can come home. Home, Lydia laughed, and the sound was bitter and sharp. That place was never my home. It was Thomas's home, and then it was your mother's home. And now you want me to come back and call it mine? After what you did? We know we don't deserve your forgiveness, Samuel said. But the land is legally yours. You have rights. I know I have rights, Lydia cut him off. I learned that the hard way. I learned it by surviving when you expected me to disappear and die quietly somewhere, so you wouldn't have to feel guilty. I learned it by building a life with my own hands, because I had no other choice. Price cleared his throat. Mrs. Harrington, there's also the matter of back rent. The brothers have been working the land since November. By law, they owe you compensation. How much? Lydia's voice was flat. Price consulted his papers. Approximately $200, based on standard agricultural rent rates. $200. More money than Lydia had ever possessed in her life. Enough to do anything. Go to Oregon, expand the cabin, start a real business, live comfortably for years. She looked at Samuel and Robert, at their guilt and discomfort and desperate hope for absolution. I'll take the money, she said coldly, and I'll take the deed to the land. But I'm not going back there. I'm selling the property to you for fair market value, $500. You can pay me in installments if you need to, but I never want to see that place again. Samuel's eyes widened. You're selling it to us? I'm selling it to someone. Might as well be you. Lydia's voice was hard. Consider it an act of mercy you don't deserve. I could make you tear down every building, could force you off the land entirely. But I'm not your mother. I'm not going to punish you for the rest of your lives because she twisted you into people you didn't want to be. Lydia, Robert's voice broke. Get off my property. Lydia gestured to the cabin, the land around it. This is mine. I built this. I earned this, and you have no place here. She turned and walked back into the cabin, leaving them standing in the snow. Daniel followed a moment later, closing the door firmly behind them. Lydia's hands were shaking so badly she couldn't light the stove. Daniel took the matches from her gently and did it himself. That was extraordinary. That was awful. Lydia collapsed into a chair. They destroyed my life, and they didn't even know they were lying. Margaret manipulated them, and they just
They just went along with it. They're weak, Daniel said quietly. You're not. You proved that. I don't feel strong. I feel furious and sick and... Her voice broke. What if I'd known 2 months ago? What if I'd fought the will, found Price myself, demanded proof? I could have stayed in the house. I wouldn't have nearly frozen. I wouldn't have... You wouldn't have learned what you're capable of. Daniel knelt beside her chair. You wouldn't have built this cabin. Wouldn't have saved Clara's life. Wouldn't have discovered you could survive anything. But I didn't have to learn that way. It was all for nothing. It wasn't for nothing. Daniel's voice was fierce. Look at what you've become, Lydia. 2 months ago, you were a woman who believed she had no value. Now you're someone who stands up to the people who wronged her and tells them exactly what they're worth. That transformation wasn't for nothing. Lydia looked around the cabin, at the walls she'd helped build, the stove that kept her warm, the supplies she'd gathered and organized. I thought this was all I had. I thought I was building from nothing. You were. The land they're giving back doesn't change what you built here. It just gives you more options. Daniel stood, moved to the window. The question is, what do you want to do with those options? I don't know. Lydia's voice was small. I thought I decided to stay, to try teaching, to build something here. But now I could have the house back, could go to Oregon, could do anything. How do I choose? The same way you've chosen everything else since November. You ask yourself what you want, not what other people expect from you. Price returned the next day with the deed and a promissory note for the $200 in back rent. The Harrington brothers had agreed to Lydia's terms for purchasing the property, $500 paid over 5 years. You're being more than fair, Price said, handing her the documents. Most people in your position would make them suffer. Most people aren't trying to build a new life, Lydia replied. Revenge doesn't interest me. Justice does. After Price left, Lydia sat with the papers spread across her table. $700 total. $200 now, $500 over time. More wealth than she'd ever imagined possessing. Daniel had given her space that morning, hadn't pushed or asked what she'd decided. But now he returned, carrying a bundle wrapped in cloth. What's this? Lydia asked. Early birthday present, or late Christmas present, or just a present. Daniel set it on the table. Open it. Inside was a hand-carved sign, the letters burned deep into polished wood. Harrington School of Winter Survival. Lydia's throat tightened. You made this? Figured if you're going to teach, you need a name for it. Thought you might want to keep your married name for business purposes. Shows you're established, respectable. Daniel's voice was careful. But if you'd rather use your maiden name, I can make a new sign. Why Harrington? Lydia traced the letters with her finger. After what that family did to me? Because Thomas gave you that name when he married you. His brothers and mother tried to take it away, said you didn't deserve it. But it's yours. You earned it by surviving what they put you through. Daniel paused. Or you can choose something else entirely. Your choice. Lydia looked at the sign, at the careful craftsmanship, at the name that had brought her so much pain and, somehow, led her to this moment. I'll keep it, she said quietly. Not because of them, because of me. Because I turned their rejection into something worth having. Daniel smiled. So you're staying? You're really doing this? I'm staying. The certainty in Lydia's voice surprised her. I'm building the school. I'm teaching. I'm making this work. And Oregon? Oregon is for people running from something. I'm not running anymore. Lydia stood, facing him. But I need you to understand something, Daniel. I'm staying because I choose to, because this is what I want to build, not because of you. I know. His voice was soft. But Lydia's heart hammered. That doesn't mean I don't want you here. As a partner, not a savior. As someone who builds alongside me, not someone who builds for me. Is that what you want? Daniel's eyes searched her face. A partnership? I think it is. Lydia took a breath. I think I'm ready to believe that two people can support each other without one being dependent on the other. That accepting help doesn't make me weak. That building something together might be better than building alone. It is better, Daniel said. So much better. He reached for her hand, and she let him take it. The spring market opened in late March, and Lydia's booth drew crowds from the first hour. She'd prepared carefully, written out curricula for winter survival courses, created charts and diagrams for shelter building, organized supply lists for various scenarios. The sign Daniel made hung prominently above her booth, and people stopped to read it with interest. "You're the woman who survived the blizzard alone?" a young homesteader asked, his eyes wide. "I am." Lydia handed him a pamphlet. "And I can teach you how to do the same. First course starts in May. $10 for a week of intensive training." $10? The man whistled. "That's steep." "So is dying because you didn't know how to build a proper shelter." Lydia's voice was matter-of-fact. "Your choice." He signed up on the spot, along with 7 others that day. By the end of the market, Lydia had collected $120 in course deposits and had a waiting list for her summer sessions. People wanted to learn from her, needed what she could teach. Clara Thompson stopped by in the afternoon, bringing her new husband, a rancher from north of Hartwell, who'd fallen in love with her after hearing about her blizzard survival. "You changed my life," Clara said, gripping Lydia's hands. "I was so lost before I found your cabin. But you showed me what real strength looks like, what it means to survive." "You showed me the same thing," Lydia replied. "Saving your life reminded me why surviving matters, why building something that lasts is worth the pain of getting there." As the sun set on the market's final day, Daniel helped Lydia pack up her remaining materials. "Successful first day," he observed, counting the money she'd earned. "You're going to need a bigger cabin if you're running courses." "I've been thinking about that." Lydia folded the sign carefully. "There's room to expand. We could build a classroom structure next to the existing cabin. Use the main cabin for housing students who come from far away." "We?" Daniel raised an eyebrow. "If you're interested in partnering on this, financially and otherwise." Lydia met his eyes. "I can't pay you back for everything you've given me, but I can offer you a share in what we build going forward. A true partnership." "I don't need payment," Daniel started. "I know, but I need to give it anyway." Lydia's voice was firm. "Not because I feel obligated. Because it's fair. Because that's what partners do. They share the work and the rewards." Daniel was quiet for a moment, then smiled. "All right, partners it is." They shook hands formally, and Lydia felt something settle into place in her chest. A sense of rightness, of things aligning as they should. 1 year later, Lydia stood in front of her completed school building and watched the sun rise over the Nebraska plains. The structure was solid, 20 feet by 15, with a wood stove, benches for students, shelves lined with survival supplies and teaching materials. Next to it stood the original cabin, expanded and improved, now serving as guest quarters for students who traveled from distant territories to learn. The Harrington School of Winter Survival had trained 63 people in its first year. 3 of them had written her letters later, thanking her because the skills she'd taught had saved their lives when unexpected storms hit. 3 lives saved. 3 people who would go on to build families, communities, futures, all because Lydia had refused to let her own suffering be meaningless. Daniel emerged from the main cabin carrying 2 cups of coffee. "Students arrive in an hour. You ready?" I'm ready. Lydia accepted the coffee, warming her hands on the cup. How did the county meeting go yesterday? They approved your proposal. You're officially recognized as a licensed survival instructor. First woman in Nebraska territory to hold that title. Daniel grinned. There's talk of the territorial government hiring you to train their survey teams. Lydia laughed. From worthless widow to government contractor. Margaret would be furious. Margaret was wrong about everything. Daniel's voice was soft. You proved that. Lydia thought about the past year, about the students she'd taught, the lives she'd touched, the business she'd built, about the marriage proposal Daniel had made 3 months ago, that she'd accepted not out of need or gratitude, but because she genuinely wanted to build a life with him. About the letter she'd received from Samuel Harrington, apologizing again and asking if she'd be willing to teach his own children survival skills someday. She thought about the woman she'd been 14 months ago, broken, desperate, convinced she had no value beyond what others assigned to her. That woman was gone. In her place stood someone stronger, someone certain of her worth, someone who'd learned that accepting help wasn't weakness, and that surviving was only the beginning of building something that mattered. You know what the difference is? Lydia said quietly. Between surviving and living? What? Surviving is what you do alone, in the dark, when you have no other choice. Living is what you do in the light, with people you choose, building something that outlasts you. She looked at Daniel, at the school, at the students approaching in the distance. I survived that winter. But this, teaching, building, creating something that helps others, this is living. Daniel put his arm around her shoulders, and they stood together, watching the sun climb higher, warming the land that had nearly killed her, and instead taught her everything she needed to become exactly who she was meant to be. Lydia Harrington had been driven from her home before the storm, had turned a cave into shelter when the blizzard came, and had emerged from that brutal winter, not as someone who'd merely endured, but as someone who'd discovered that her value had never depended on anyone else's judgment. It had been there all along, waiting for her to recognize it herself.